This is Proxy Countdown. Welcome to the big show for the week of April 15th, 2024, alongside my tag team partner, Matt Mascardi. I'm Damian Rawls, and today's countdown, big changes at Tesla, including a petulant proxy statement. Comcast finally appoints a female director with media experience. Proxy contest chaos at Macy's and Crown Castle. A detailed look at the final vote results at Disney. And on the big vote, one of our favorite Chicago mafia companies, Abbott Laboratories. Let's get to our trade wire, our top stories. Two of Tesla's top executives have left the company in the midst of the carmaker's largest ever round of job cuts, as slowing electric vehicle demand leads the company to reduce its global headcount by more than 10%. Out, our senior vice president, Drew Baglino, one of the named executive officers, who co-hosted earnings calls and shared the stage with CEO Elon Musk at multiple events, and Rohan Patel, the carmaker's vice president of public policy and business development. JP Morgan Chase announced that two of its directors, Timothy Flynn and Michael Neal, have decided to retire from the board at the company's 2024 annual meeting of shareholders, meaning that its board will officially be half men and half women. At Brown & Brown, where 73% of board influence is controlled by father and son, Chair J. Hyatt Brown and CEO J. Howell Brown, the J. Browns, James Hayes and his 2% influence, one of 12 other non-powerful, non-Brown family member board members, has stepped down.
What a loss.
The company also announced that it has purchased a new stapler for one of its medium-sized conference rooms.
Really? Just one?
And lastly, Comcast Corporation has appointed a fourth woman to its board, Wanya Lucas. Female influence on Comcast's board is woefully low at under 10% combined. Wanya, Comcast's first black female director, will be the only woman on the board with actual media experience, as she was previously CEO of Hallmark Media Networks. Let's go over our proxy cage matches. Let's get back to our non-Disney proxy cage matches. Yes, the Disney proxy cage match is finally over. Let's go to Macy's.
What?
Macy's proxy contest with Ark House is over, as Richard Clark and Richard Markey, two Richards, have been added to the board. The company also added its own nominee, Douglas Sessler, while board chair Jeff Jeanette stepped down, along with finance committee chair Francis Blake. There are now 15 Macy's directors, Matt, which may explain the rather confusing and overwhelming layout of its department stores.
There was a lot of boys moving around just now.
Chaos also continues at Crown Castle, as Stephen Moskowitz has been named the new permanent CEO, amid an ongoing proxy contest where company founder Ted Miller and Boots Capital Management have nominated 4 directors to the Crown Castle board. All 4 nominees are men, of course, and one of their opposed nominees is a woman. So if the proxy contest is successful, the Crown Castle board will consist of 10 men and only 2 women. Notably, 2 Boots nominees are older than the company's director retirement age, and a third nominee is within 1 year of the company's director retirement age. There you go.
Apparently, they don't require that you read bylaws before you actually file the contest.
And finally, Tesla seems to be begging for some kind of proxy contest at its upcoming annual meeting, as it taunts skeptical shareholders by calling for the re-election of 2 of its, quote, hardworking and dedicated directors, Kimball Musk and James Murdoch, end quote, asking shareholders to approve moving Tesla's state of incorporation from Delaware to Texas, and to re-ratify Elon Musk's 2018 compensation package that was recently rejected by the Delaware Court of Chancery and Judge Kathleen McCormick.
Look, I don't want to spend a lot of time with this because we will eventually.
We will.
But I will say, re-electing Kimball Musk and James Murdoch would basically just suggest that investors don't care ever anywhere about any director that ever gets voted onto a board. Wouldn't it? Like, we shouldn't be doing this show. ISS and Glass Lewis don't need to exist. Who needs our data set? Like, it's bananas that this is even a question, because dedicated and hardworking are not the skills that are the overriding skills to be a board member, when it's really brother and friend that is the adjectives missing.
I was going to say hardworking doesn't usually go along with two of America's greatest Nepo babies, the Nepo twins, Kimball Musk and James Murdoch. Let's move over to our vote results table. AGM season is really starting to pick up, so we have a lot of large cap companies to report on. Let's start with the big vote at Disney, where Trian Funds was officially defeated. So here's the final vote tallies. Nelson Peltz received 31% support, while Jay Rasulo received a paltry 12%. Not saying a lot about Jay there. Blackwell's nominees were basically ignored. They all received roughly 2% of the vote. As far as Disney directors go, CEO Bob Iger received 94% support, which is telling considering that Nelson Peltz received 31% support. While Trian target Maria Elena Lagomasino received 63% support. Two other generic targets in this proxy contest were Chair Mark Parker and Michael Froman. They each received 88% of the vote. And finally, 20% of voters rejected Say on Pay, while the two anti-ESG shareholder proposals both received average support of about 3% of the lunatic fringe of Disney for shareholders.
You buried the lead here.
Go ahead.
Which Blackwell's nominees, Greg Hadkoff got 2%.
Mm-hmm.
Lee Sullivan got 2%. Jessica Schell got 2.1%. That's called the proxy countdown bump.
That
baby.
0.1 is
That's
attributed to us, yes.
That's entirely us.
We pushed Jessica Schell. We pushed kind of all of the Blackwell's nominees, but especially Jessica Schell. So that 0.1% is the free float vote.
But you really can see here that like the vote was just taking bites out of apples. It was Peltz got 31 and Lagomasino got 63. It was basically, that's, if you were going to vote for Peltz, it was coming from Lagomasino's vote. Rasulo got 12 and Froman got 88. If you were voting for Rasulo, it came from Froman's vote. Parker is the interesting one, but you had Norgis say that they weren't going to support Parker in the first place.
And this guy right here. I was against Parker.
Guy, right? So I'm going to say that like the 88%, roughly 9% of that was because of Norgis, and roughly 0.1% of that was the Damien proxy countdown bump.
I will say this, I, as a final word on the vote at Disney, is that shame on you, Nelson Peltz, because you kind of ruined this. If you didn't open your mouth and reveal your racism and misogyny, and you didn't appoint a fellow director, Jay Rasulo, who was just the suckiest choice ever, this actually could have been an interesting contest, but you just 100%. Sort of, your ego just kind of blew it. I mean, really.
That's the read. In fact, like if not for Peltz, we would be having a totally different conversation about Disney. We would have suggested voting out half this board. They're cozy, they're insular, there's skills gaps. Listen to the show. But yeah, he ruined it. He blew it.
Because the key number here, which sums up how much he did blow it and how it was an anti-Peltz vote, is CEO Bob Iger getting 94% support.
94.
Synopsis, a vote at Synopsis, 20% of voters said no to Bruce Chizen, while 15% of voters rejected Janice Chafin. Despite this unrest, only 33% of the vote supported a shareholder proposal calling for an independent chair. I don't really get that. I don't really understand why shareholders would ever vote against having an independent chair.
I totally agree with. I don't understand. In fact, when we talk about Abbott 2 years ago, they had the same vote and shareholders rejected that too. But maybe this was just an anti-last names that start with CH vote.
Shareholder proposals fared well at Lennar. After adjusting for CEO and Chair Stuart Miller's 38% voting power, all three proposals would have passed. A report on political spending, a report on LGBTQ equity and inclusion efforts in its human capital management strategy, and a report on the company's plans to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. All would have passed without, this one man controlling most of the will.
I mean, it's so fun to allow one person to control what every shareholder thinks.
Something interesting going on at A.O. Smith. All 6 Class A directors were reelected with ease as the Smith family controls 97% of Class A shares. However,
Shocked, yeah.
common stock directors were met with investor anger, although I can't really quite figure out why, as Victoria Holt and Elam Kadri, the only 2 common stock female directors, each received a majority of votes against their re-election. So I don't really quite know what's going on at A.O. Smith.
To put that in context, that happens 0.2% of the time in global votes. That's super rare to get a majority against.
Except at A.O. Smith, since there's a plurality vote standard, that means that even if you only got 1 vote, you'd get reelected because they just take the directors with the most votes. And since it's not an uncontested election, there's only 4 directors up for 4 seats. It doesn't really matter. You just needed 1 vote.
Thank God for bylaws.
You needed 1 vote. And finally, shareholders are basically content or not paying attention at Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, the Bank of New York Mellon, and Matt's favorite, Carnival Corporation.
What? There was no free float bump
Don't
at
care.
Carnival?
Nobody cares.
Really? Shocking.
All right, let's get over to our big vote. We have an annual meeting coming up on April 26th. That's next week at Abbott Laboratories. I don't look. I'm looking forward to your dissection of Abbott Laboratories, one of our favorite Chicago mafia companies, and you can explain why that is when you get to your analysis. But from a outsider's perspective, there's not a ton going on here. It's kind of a typical ownership structure. The main 2 owners are BlackRock and Vanguard Group, each with around 10%. There's a bit of a diversity power gap here, which is a bit concerning. So the diverse directors represent 25% of the board, but only 11% of actual influence. So it's suggesting a little bit of tokenism when it comes to racial board members at Abbott. Other than that, the one thing I want to pick out, and I don't know if you have any insight into this, is that there actually are some notably high votes against 3 directors. That's lead director Nancy McKinstry. She got 25% votes against last year, which is extremely high in the S&P 500. In fact, she has been over 20% against every year since 2020, which is a lot. I mean, shareholders clearly don't like Nancy McKinstry. Also this year, Michael Roman, 16% against, and John Stratton, 28% against. So shareholders are kind of paying attention about some things at Abbott Laboratories, which is interesting.
Let's say not.
Okay, go ahead.
Maybe.
Take over.
All right. So first of all, there's a lot that shareholders could be paying attention to and angry about. This stock is the performance of the stock is something that no one would be happy with. They've underperformed the S&P 500 over 3 months, 1 year, 2 year, and 5 year time periods. They've just underperformed.
And you can kind of roughly see this if you look quickly at our performance indicators. The overall board is hitting 524 in earnings, but only 439 in total shareholder returns, suggesting that the directors are kind of leaving some shareholder money on the table, right? Like they're kind of squandering something, maybe potentially.
Not only that. This is also a company that is under a tremendous amount of scrutiny, given recalls on infant formula. There were contaminated formula. There were issues with supply chain. Remember during the pandemic,
right.
the Abbott was at the center of that. There's over 1,000 outstanding legal cases. On the last earnings call, they were asked about it directly when they think they're going to see some resolutions, and they were optimistic, quote unquote, that they would get some news soon.
Okay.
But there's a lot of things weighing on Abbott as well, alongside recalls for devices. They have they have some issues, right? The board is a monarchy. That a monarchy is a widely held company where the CEO has the majority of influence. It basically means you sort of have CEO kings, right?
That would be at Abbott Laboratories. That would be Bob Ford. He controls 21% of the influence, and he's the chair and the CEO. So So Matt, just to be clear, he heads the oversight board that is meant to oversight himself. That's what it means when a CEO is also the chair.
My favorite thing is when, and I think this is typical, but I still like seeing it. Abbott shows you the number of meetings that each committee had, and they have an executive committee of the board, and the executive committee met 0 times in 2023. Wow. 0 times.
Do you need to meet when you have Bob Ford kind of taking care of everything?
I suppose not. I mean,
really, it would have been the meeting. Really, would be what Bob Ford is thinking at night in bed,
that moment,
right? Like or whatever, wherever he is.
I wrote something down. Let's do that. But here's your last vote, your 2023 vote overview. The reason why Stratton and McKinstry got negative votes is because they crossed the Glass-Lewis ISS threshold for overboarding. They were on too many boards between the two of them. So that was very much a policy vote. McKinstry she's been on too many boards since before 2020. In fact, you go back in time, McKinstry is part of a group of directors that include the Boeing circles, that include 3M circles. She is actually a longtime board member and a well-known board member across these groups. So these votes actually reflect crossing a policy threshold, which is the count of boards that these people are on. But don't worry, investors, because at Abbott Labs, there actually aren't that many meetings that these directors have had anyway. Michael Roman, who's the CEO of 3M, is a mystery vote, but I'm guessing it's for a similar reason. There's some policy that got triggered somewhere, and I couldn't put that one together. But I did find the overboarding threshold for Stratton and McKinstry. But for this year, our recommendations, the analysis, I would tell you that you should totally ignore anything about overboarding, anything about coziness of the board, or anything about overboarding, anything about like policy. Focus on the coziness of the board and focus on performance gaps. So that's where we're going to go.
Let's do it.
All right. I want to say that this is basically a foreshadow of what we're going to see at Boeing and what we would see if we did 3M. There is this old school, and we've talked about it before, American board aristocracy, right? Like the board bro culture. It's mostly bros, obviously, but it's this old culture. And we lovingly have been calling it for years the Chicago Mafia.
Yeah. That's probably not only because of the overlaps you see on the actual public company boards, but when you dig deeper, you see them on just about every civic board known to Chicago. It might even be like the Chicago Cubs Cracker Jack Peanuts board. Whatever it is, they're there together hanging out.
That's what. Yeah. So that is what I'm calling the cocktail loop, right?
Okay,
like,
fine.
As an
whatever
example,
you want to call it, they're there.
The Economic Club of Chicago, both O'Grady, who's on this board, and Blunt, who's on this board, are also board members of the Economic Club of Chicago. The Minnesota Business Partnership, Mike Roman, and Starks are on that board of the Minnesota Business. This repeats ad nauseum.
Yep.
And by way of example, it's very specific to the Midwest. So I would say direct Chicago influence on this board, meaning people who live in Chicago, work for companies in Chicago, represents 44% of board influence. Nearly half of the board influence is in one city.
Yeah,
forget state or country, even region, whatever.
And don't forget that these directors don't work full time for the company. They don't. It's not like they have to be in Chicago, right? I mean, they could come from anywhere.
Oh, 100%. Directors Boeing just hired, to their credit, their first international director. You can have international directors. Sure. It's possible. I'm just saying it's possible.
Yeah.
At this board, you are talking about the CEO of Northern Trust, which is based in Chicago, the CEO of Feeding America, based in Chicago, a professor at Northwestern, the Kellogg School, it's in Chicago. And then there's the soft Chicago links, what I'm calling indirect Chicago, which is they went to school at Northwestern, or they're based in Illinois an hour from Chicago, or they're in the in Wisconsin.
These are the southern part of Wisconsin, right?
Yeah, like that kind of thing. If you're within like 2 hours, you can drive to your board meeting, right? That's that level of influence is 51% of the board, which means 95% of the board influence is effectively 2 hours around Chicago, two and a half hours around.
And
Chicago.
And people from Chicago, they have this term called Chicagoland. So it's like Chicagoland is basically what you just described, right? It's Milwaukee, it's Northern Illinois, it's basically everything within a quick drive. So you're right. This is why we call it Chicago Mafia, because as you're saying, 95% of influence is represented by this Chicagoland director, which is
there's only
absurd.
one director that does not live in Chicagoland, and those are like just the Chicago loops, right? I want to talk about network loops.
Mm-hmm.
There are like hard connections, as in people, these directors who have sat on other boards with each other, right? Or they know each other through a friend, where there's overlapping time with that friend on a board. For Abbott Labs, they have 182 loops between Director A and Director B.
Wow.
From Abbott Labs to Abbott Labs since 2010. 182 times in our database does a director at Abbott Labs have some connection to another director at Abbott Labs.
Wow.
Through directly or through a friend, right? That is a monstrous amount of loops.
Yeah.
If you do the math, it's 14 years. That means like on average, you're talking about many loops per year.
Yeah.
In fact, this year, 5 of the current board members have loops. In fact, only one current board member doesn't loop through a spin-off of Abbott Labs that spun off years ago through AbbVie. So these are directors that sit on boards with somebody at AbbVie who knows somebody who they know, right? Like that's it. It's really, these are closely related directors. And that's just the hard ones. These are directors who, let's paint the picture. They live in Chicago or work around Chicago. They actually are on boards with each other or have all their friends are on the same boards. And then there's something new I want to introduce this week called soft connections.
Soft? What's a soft connection? Like a soft pretzel?
So, yeah, it's exactly
at a Chicago White Sox game?
The White Sox.
Sorry, really? they'd be at the Cubs game.
They'd be at the Cubs.
Yeah,
they would never go to a White Sox game. No, I want to introduce a concept called modularity.
Okay.
So when you sign up for LinkedIn or Facebook, well, you're deep on you're constantly posting.
I'm deep on all social media. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's math that you can use in a social network. If you're a node and I'm a node in this network, the line between us, the relationship between us would be an edge because we work together. That's like node to node straight up.
Okay.
Well, when you do that across a really large network, you can count all the edges and you can count the length between people. It's like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon,
sure.
Right? Well, there is an algorithm that will effectively say, how can we cluster people who are closely related but not directly related?
Okay.
That is a community. So when you're on LinkedIn or Facebook and it says, oh, you know Matt, you might also know Francis because Matt knows Francis or 2 degrees removed from them, right?
It reminds me of going to a party at college where you walk, you're kind of like feeling a little fear going, will I know anyone? But when you walk in, everyone kind of looks alike, smells alike, you feel comfortable, right?
Exactly.
It's like this is my place. These are my buddies.
Think of this as going to Beta Psi or whatever the hell.
I'm not thinking that, no.
So we can run this for boards. We run this across 220,000 directors since 2010.
Okay.
So we've got like 15, 16 years of data in here and a whole lot of directors, including we add in 40,000 NEOs and we can do things like some nonprofit boards here and there when we can get the data. But when we run this and we look at Abbott, what we find is 92% of the board members of Abbott Labs are in the exact same board community. So now
Yeah.
you have people
92%.
who live 92%. You have people who live in Chicago or the Chicago area effectively running this board. They are on boards with their own friends or together, and all of their friends and each other live in the same board communities.
Yeah.
They all know, like they're all like, they could all show up at a party and be like, hey, aren't you so-and-so? Yeah, we know so-and-so together. Let's fist bump and have a beer.
Yeah.
That is the board that has been elected here. And that is the history of the Abbott board. When Miles White was the CEO and chair, it was even worse. They had Bill Osborne on the board. They've had some of the most interconnected board members in our database run through the Abbott Labs board. So that's what you're seeing.
This seems like a bit of a shareholder risk that should be listed in the 10K. That if there are poison hot dogs at Wrigley Field, all of our board might die together at once, right? No, all of them except for one.
Well, the risk here is groupthink. I don't know that it's poison hot dogs, but they are all going to Wrigley Field.
Out of curiosity, who is this lone member who's not part of this group? Do you have that name?
The lone member who's not in the Stratton is the one who's not in the Chicago geographical
That's the only
region.
one, John Stratton. Okay.
But he does have a board connection. So even though he's not in Chicago, he has a board connection back to Abbott. Okay. So there is no one on the board who isn't connected in one of these ways. Mm-hmm. Same community, same actual geographic location.
This is why we call it the Chicago Mafia companies. Yeah.
Exactly. Combine all that with the fact that you have, for 6 of the board members, a gap between their earnings batting average and their TSR batting average. Mm-hmm. Or I'm sorry, their controversy batting average.
Yeah, this is a big one. So we have found when at several companies that when you often see a lower TSR compared to earnings, often the reason is controversies. Right? Controversies is often a drag on earnings. On earnings, which result in a low TSR.
So here's what you would expect. If you have high earnings, but a lot of controversial activity going on, one of the things that you can see is, have these controversies actually manifested to hurt earnings yet? Mm-hmm. Right now, what we have is a team full of people who are really good at making short-term money, but are really bad at these controversies that keep reoccurring. In fact, when you look at the other boards that they've been on, like Boeing, inside the loops here are Boeing, which do we need to discuss the sort of long-term ridiculousness of Boeing that's resulted in it being one of the worst companies in America, and 3M, who had to settle a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit for its earplugs because it took a shortcut, sold earplugs to the United States military, and are in the process of basically trying to clean up a giant mess. What you're seeing is lots of short-term decision-making that results in high earnings for these people and often can translate to high TSR, but we're seeing the controversies performance of these directors underperform, and they're recycling them, so the culture's not changing, right?
Yeah, and it brings up something that you've mentioned in the past about Boeing, is that instead of having engineers on the board, they have a lot of marketing expertise, right? Which are people who are good at short-term thoughts, short-term sales, short-term earnings, right?
That's right. Yeah. And when you're mentioning skills here, right? Like the skills on the Abbott board actually mirrors what you're talking about. And I like to think of it this way. If you pull only people from Chicago, what kind of people, like if we're in the Boston-ish area, right? Like we kind of associate Boston-ish. You're in Maine, I'm in Connecticut. Yeah. If we were to pull only people from Boston, you'd get a bunch of dudes named Sully, and they probably are all like anesthesiologists.
Yeah,
right? Like they're all
smart people. Boston's known for smart people.
A lot of colleges in the area, a lot of biotech, a lot of, medicine is a very medical
We call them
city.
Smart people, Matt.
Sure. And a lot of dudes named Sully who watch the
Sully,
Red Sox.
we don't usually see Sully on boards.
If you apply that same thinking, that regional, almost parochial thinking, if Abbott Labs keeps pulling from the Chicago area, the Chicagoland area, and maintains a Chicago mafia where they're all connected, what kind of skills do you expect to see except the kind that exist in that area?
Yeah, and of course, I'm thinking of the joke of the Clark Griswold from the Vacation movies, famously located in Chicago, where Clark was this kind of buffoony guy in marketing and sales. Like they were always going to these funny scenes in the office where they were selling something stupid or marketing something stupid, or that's what Chicago's kind of known for.
I think of like Tommy Boy.
Marketing dumb things, yeah.
But what you see is 66% of the influence on this board is retail manufacturing and consulting. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of headhunters, consultants, like Midwestern manufacturers. They're all there. Right. 2/3 of the board is basically
all
that.
The same skill set, yeah.
13% of the board is finance. Or some finance background. Only 19% of the influence on this board is biotech and healthcare for a biotech and healthcare company. And that's without the executive. That means the executive is largely the only person in the room who has biotech manufacturing experience. No one else does. We said this with Disney. Yeah, it's the same thing.
And didn't you, ironically, didn't you say that one of those people with biotech healthcare experience is someone from New England, actually, from Yale?
Yes, the only person with the biotech experience is from Yale. He's a doctor from Yale, and he is 73 years old and is the longest tenured director, which means if you get rid of the longest tenured director because he's been there since 2008, and say, okay, your time has come and gone. You've done great service. Thank you, sir, for your service. Fist bump on the way out. You're left with zero biotech experience or healthcare experience. To put it in contrast, right? Bristol Myers Squibb, who's one of their biggest competitors, 1/3 of the board are doctors. 1/3 of the board. And not only that, they're based in New York. They have people from Chicago. They got people from Boston. They got an international person. They have people from all over on that board. Right. Now, Bristol Myers Squibb doesn't necessarily, like in the short term, hasn't been outperforming Abbott Labs in terms of stock price. But in terms of thinking, at least they've got a different group going. At least you got a little bit of diversity of thought. So here's my recommendation.
Let's do it.
You're in a rock and a hard place, given the skills, given the connections, given the Chicagoland mafia. How do you do this? I think it's a multi-year process. I think you have to vote some people out this year, and then there's a second year you're going to have to keep cleaning up. This year, I think your vote is against a director named Kumbier, Michelle Kumbier. Mm-hmm. She shows up in the most links back to this board. She actually bridges the gap between the Miles White years and the current years. She's high influence, and she's part of that overweighted skill set of manufacturing. In fact, she works at like lawn care. I think they make it's not like deer, like they do hand, zappy things. I don't know. They're cutting things and stuff. Mm-hmm. I think, as far as Chicago Mafia Guard goes, she's bridging the old and the new, and she's part of the old culture. And I don't think it makes sense she doesn't need to be there any longer. Okay. I don't think it makes any sense.
I'm not going to argue with you.
I also think you vote against Stratton.
Yeah.
Not only is he a link to the past, but he is overboarded. And he has a gap in performance, a really big earnings controversies gap. I think in that case, you're voting to start replacing some of that short-term thinking and start thinking long-term.
Let me add one name to the mix. That's because you mentioned 3M. So I want to mention Michael Roman, who already got 16% votes against the last election. He also sits on the board of 3M. And according to our metrics, he is hitting 738 in earnings, which is extremely high. Good for him. But only 220 in TSR. I say get rid of Michael Roman too, right? Why do we need a 3M? Why do we need another guy laden in controversies? This guy's hitting 0.031 in controversies.
Yeah.
He's on 3M and Abbott Laboratories. I don't think we need Michael Roman.
So he's my year. Roman and McKinstry are my year twos.
Okay. There you go.
I think year two, they're both gone. And I think when you're thinking of this, what you're doing is you're making places, you're opening up spots to add doctors, healthcare, non-Chicago.
For
Those
yeah.
are the things you need.
For those of you who listen and think that our data or our point of view is too aggressive, this is not about voting out directors. This is about what Matt just pointed out, which is opening vacancies for refreshment, for bringing on skill sets which are important for your company. This is not a personal vendetta.
No, I don't know these people.
No one's feelings are going to get hurt. These people are going to be okay. They'll get they can get a directorship at the Chicago Opera. I don't care. They can go
somehow they will survive.
They'll sell some more fertilizer and make some more money. They'll survive. So this is really an opportunity. People always characterize this as a negative thing. This is actually an opportunity to create board refreshment with sound data and analytics, and not just kind of a old-fashioned policy that was invented 20 years ago, where you target directors who stand on their left foot for 8 seconds. Or yeah, right.
All right. So to sum it up, I'm voting against Coombier and Stratton this year. I'm voting against Roman McKinstry next year, and I'm not voting against them. I'm voting for new skills and for new geographic diversity and mental diversity.
Before we wrap up, there are no shareholder proposals at Abbott Laboratories. As far as pay goes, I don't know what to say anymore. The S&P 500 companies, other than the fact that these CEOs make an extraordinary amount of money. I could dig into the policies here, but when you see a CEO making $23 million a year, I don't even know if I need to go into the policies anymore. It just seems absurdly high to me.
This is one where I would vote against pay, not the pay people. Okay. And I would do it for this reason. Mm-hmm. I can't figure this out, and this might happen all the time, and maybe I just notice it. Maybe I'm an idiot. The NEOs here are held to the same sort of targeting standard that the CEO is. That happens all the time. I don't remember a place where an NEO, in this case, there are 2 or 3, but the nutrition executive, the guy who leads the nutrition division, got his target ended up at 96% of target, right?
Okay.
So below the 100%.
For his annual award.
For his annual award, 96%. But the CEO got 112%. So Ford got himself 112%. How can the CEO ever get a target above what the NEOs? Isn't he the reflection of the worst of the NEOs?
Yeah, well,
it's his job.
In fact, 10% of the CEO's annual bonus is something called human capital metrics, and the goal is to meet talent, succession planning, and diversity targets. So it would suggest right there that, yes, Matt, that is part of his job. One of the problems with these pay packages is that if you're going to pay someone $23 million a year, can you do better than kind of telling us some kind of soft targets? Could we see some actual metrics and numbers? Because as an example, for the human capital metrics, the CEO achieved this with, that's all it says, achieved. And as an example, Executive Vice President Daniel Salvadori, he mostly achieved this. And they don't tell you why. They just say achieved, mostly achieved. Like, really, if you're going to be giving out this much of money, just tell us, show us the data.
Well, that's the second thing. And I did way back in the day, maybe 7-8 years ago, when we were back at the mothership at MSCI, I did a show about peer groups. Here's another case of peer groups where I looked at Abbott's peer groups they chose for pay, and this is common. This happens all the time. When you look at the sizes of the companies that they choose, they make the median of the companies equal almost exactly Abbott. Mm-hmm. They're very they're not going to pick companies all over the place that to make it a big skew, except that they do skew the companies. And what they do is they tend to put a number of companies that are way bigger.
Yeah.
In fact, when you run the skew numbers, the median is almost exactly Abbott, but the tail of the distribution of size of the companies is bigger. It skews larger, meaning if you want to increase your pay but do it subtly, make the median of the peer group that you self-selected through a consultant equal your company, but choose large companies that pay a lot more on one end, and the small companies on the other end, you make sure that they just make the median right.
Yeah,
right?
I was going to say, anecdotally, it seems like Microsoft is just magically in everybody's peer group.
Yeah, somehow. I mean, in this one, you have Coca-Cola. Mm-hmm. Like because babies drink formula and Coca-Cola eventually? How does that work?
Let me add one other thing here before we wrap up, and this is how absurd the state of pay is in the U.S. for CEOs. Is that it's worth remembering that I'm looking at the long-term incentive target, which for the CEO Bob Ford is roughly $13 million, right? $13 million. No matter how poor the results are for this given year, it can't be less than 75% of this target,
That's
which
another
comes
thing. It's
a number that
bananas.
is pulled out of thin air. This $13 million. So he hits 75% of this target if he screws up everything, which means that it's basically guaranteed equity at $10 million a year, no matter how bad, no matter what the hell is going on at Abbott Laboratories. That's guaranteed pay, and that's out of the realm of like common decency, I'd say.
I will forget decency. I think it's one of the greatest polls that you've been doing over the past year, which is if you want to talk about the meritocracy, you want to talk about holding people accountable, you want to talk about performance. These people are getting paid. Their performance could be the 0th percentile. They could be the absolute bottom of every company
every target.
on Earth.
Miss every target.
Every TSR target you could possibly lay out, still get 75% of their target back.
Not just
that
TSR,
is
Matt.
insane.
Everything. You could miss cash flow. You can miss earnings per share. All of them, and you're going to get 75% of that.
So then, at that point. Why are we?
What are we doing?
What are we doing? Why are we even setting pay? You might as well just give them the money.
You could just say we guarantee that if you're a CEO or an executive officer here, you're going to get about $20 million. So just stop talking to us.
I mean, in any other industry, if you ranked in the 0th percentile of everything you did, would you get 75% of?
I mean, Matt, even in the NFL,
salary?
where people are launching their bodies at you and you're getting concussions and you're breaking your leg every day, they can even cut you. That pay's not guaranteed.
No, I know most of it's not guaranteed.
Yeah.
No athlete is. If you're like there are a few athletes that are.
All right, we're way off. We're way off the track here.
Anyway. So I say in this case, you're going to vote against pay. Forget the committee because we have other board problems to deal with. But this is a good time to vote against just the pay. And it's not because it's just egregious. The stock stinks. And we got to be asking questions about like, how does the NEO hit a higher target or get a lower target than the CEO, who should be held to the minimum standard, I think is a rule. You want to set up a policy rule. Whatever the lowest NEO performance is by target, that's what the CEO should get. No matter what the other metrics say, because that doesn't make any sense. And there's so many things wrong. So I say you vote against pay, you vote against
Michelle
Coumbier,
John Stratton. Next year, you say vote against Nancy McKinstry, Michael Roman.
Yeah, that's what I say.
That's the proxy countdown for the week of April 15th, 2024. Join us next week when we jump back into the alternative democracy pool forever. On the lookout for shareholder sharks, floating band-aids, and wayward directors.